Welcome back. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some effects of Russia colonial rule on Central Asia's political, social, and economic systems. I'll just do a quick review of that since I covered that in the last class. And then we're mostly going to focus on the Russian revolutions, the events and the significance for Central Asia. So, basically, what happened in Russia in 1905 and 1917, and how all this affected Central Asia. So, a quick review of the pros and cons. This is a slide that I meant to put up on the last set of slides, but didn't. So again, what the Russians did bring is they brought peace for an area that was volatile, where the Khanates were in constant rebellion, and they brought order as well. They abolished cruel punishment, which was common under the Khanates, and they brought some limited modernization in terms of educational system, infrastructure, especially telecommunications. Well, really, especially the railroad. But the cons included the relative limited nature of this modernization. It was really only designed to serve the interests of the metropole, which is common in colonial and imperial states. The norms of good government, they weren't norms of good government at all. They were norms of drunkenness and inefficiency. It was also culturally oppressive. They began to bring more and more of the Muslim schools into incorporating them into Russian schools. And finally, the long and short-term economic costs of economic reform, which I talked about before with respect especially to cotton. That's the clincher here. So moving into the picture that you see here is a picture of a Cossack running off and slaughtering revolutionaries in Odessa. 1905, and the Cossacks, again, they played an important role in Central Asia in the Russian Empire because they were sort of the loyalists to the Tsar. Now, 1905 marks the first stage in the Russian Revolution, something that the Cossacks didn't like, which is why the picture is there. This is a phenomenon that's going to have enormous impact on Central Asia as we go along. To make a very long story short, what happened is that industrial workers, backed by parts of the bourgeois nobility, especially students, who were frustrated at losing the Russo-Japanese War, led a rebellion against the Tsar. The Tsar responded with concessions, known as the October Manifesto. The October Manifesto issued a litany of freedoms: freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of association. The most important thing it did, in concrete terms, was establish an authoritative parliamentary body known as the Duma. Duma from the Russian word dumats, which means to think, which is not what these guys ended up actually doing there. But it was the ideal. So it's important to keep in mind that Russia, ergo Central Asia, had always been ruled by a very small clique. This, remember, with a tyranny of small decisions that led to Russia's deeper incursion into Central Asia, really involved a debate at the very top. They didn't have an elected parliamentary body debating these things. Democracy in a monarchy is really limited to that nobility who support the Tsar needs in order to maintain power. So the Duma is a major new development. But at its first meeting, it considered itself real and made a number of demands, including the release of political prisoners, more rights for trade unions, land reform, and the revolution turned out to be very short-lived because none of this was stuff that Tsar Nicholas II really wanted to do. He rejected all these proposals. He eventually dissolved the Duma after a period of time. It was later reconstituted, but it was muffled basically for most of the time between 1906 at least and 1917. Did not have a real voice. Now, looking at Central Asia, these events had relatively little meaning in Central Asia at the time. There was a lack of a working class, which meant that very few people were actually involved in this whole thing, Central Asians. So when you look at Central Asia, there were only a relative few who were industrialists who were active. In other words, the proletariat, industrial class. The working class was maybe 40,000 people, especially miners and railroad workers. But these people were dominated by Slavs, and in particular Russians. So if you're not familiar, Slavs also include Ukrainians, Belarusians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles. So it's a broad cultural identity. But really we're talking about Russians here for the most part. Recall that the railroad came from Russia. It brought employees out for quick bucks. And so that's how the working class existed. It's primarily a Russian working class. Now, there were spontaneous, I guess revolts might be a little strong, but there was the rise of native intellectuals and activists. who made demands such as a return of land, limits on the Orthodox Church, but they were fairly weak. They fizzled out along with the revolution. Again, the 1905 revolution didn't leave much of a mark. Under colonization, a majority of the intellectual elites tended to be weak or co-opted. So the rise of these native intellectuals was almost doomed from the beginning. In addition, though, there was some increased unrest among the peasantry. Some peasants joined bandit gangs in the hills. They even had a Robin Hood sort of figure. This guy, Namaz Pirim Kulov, who was an ex-convict who lived around Samarkand. He organized, organized is a tough word because it was actually a fairly unorganized movement. It was a fairly isolated movement, as peasant movements tend to be. But he was sort of this Robin Hood who would go in and rob from the rich and redistribute. But really, they lacked a grand political plan. So this didn't go very far. Despite this, though, Russian military leaders in the region were quite nervous. The colonized peoples now saw weakness in their metropole, in the master. The governor general at the time, Sakharov, wrote back to St. Petersburg, quote, "It is to be feared that the natives will doubt the power of the Russian authorities if they see with their own eyes that we are completely powerless to struggle with a handful of young people who ignore the administration and the police." Now, it's visible that the workers' revolt in Russia led to expressions of dissent across social strata. Slav industrialists, those native intellectuals, native peasants. But again, they were fairly weak. Now, what the 1905 revolution did do is it led to the rise of the Jadids. The Jadids actually started in the late 19th century Russia. They were led by Tatars in the Volga and the Crimea, in those two regions. And they really thrived in cities of learning throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. Places like Bukhara, Kokand, where the madrasas, these religious institutions of learning, were based. These people, the Jadid actually means new in Arabic. These were the Muslim reformers. So their goals were modernization of the religious schools, but also to push for a Muslim and a pan-Turkic, maybe pan-Islamic identity in the region. This earned them enemies among Russians and also native religious elites, the ulama. Ulama are these native religious elites. So they were really opposed from two sides because both of them, the traditional clergy and the czarist officials, had something to lose from this modernization program that they were pushing. Between 1905 and 1914, so after the 1905 revolution, more than 100 Jadid schools opened around Central Asia. One representative of the emir in Bukhara commented, quote, "In the first year, the students will learn to read newspapers. In the second, they will demand freedoms. And in the third, they will turn His Highness from his throne and into prison." So the Jadids were cracked down upon and they were driven underground. Now, as Jadid schools opened up around Central Asia in the early 20th century, though, there were increased splits between the masses and local elites. Some of them wanted restitution of land, others wanted autonomy and breakup of the empire, so major divergences in terms of the grand political plan. Governance in the area during this time was characterized by, again, these corrupt administrators, which we talked about before, seizure of land and water, forced disruption of nomadic lifestyle, everything that I talked about in the last class. And also this creation of this landless peasantry. Russians got all the good land, but not even enough for them. So people who were forced to settle were settling with very little land. So we'll take a break there.